Norse mythology has Mjölnir, the magical, skull-smashing hammer of Thor. British mythology boasts Excalibur, the sword that granted King Arthur, quote, supreme executive power after some, quote, watery tart threw it at him. Source, Monty Python. Greek mythology gets the trident of Poseidon, that famed three-pronged fork used to such great watery effect. Wait, did he just call Poseidon's trident a fork? Yes, I did. I just hope that comment doesn't come back to fork me at the end of this video. Spoiler alert, it will. Now, what about Irish mythology? Rarely do the mythical weapons of Ireland appear in popular culture, but as you'll soon discover, that's not because its arsenal is lacking. Irish mythology is brimming with swords, spears, shields, and other weapons that have served Irish heroes and gods and monsters, both well and not so well, on the battlefield. Some of these weapons are instilled with magical properties, some are sentient and seem to have lives of their own, and still others earned their legendary status based solely on the power and prowess of their wielders. The following is a comprehensive-ish list of the most famous weapons from Irish mythology, organized by type. Swords from Irish mythology. 1. Caladcholg, hard dinter. Also given as Caladcholg, meaning hard blade or hard cleft, this was the sword of Fergus MacRoth, former king of Ulster who gave up his throne to Conor MacNessa. During the Táin Bó Cúailnge cattle raid of Cooley, which is the longest and arguably most influential story in Irish mythology's Ulster cycle, MacRoth famously uses Caladcholg to level the 3 bald-topped hills of Meath with 3 strokes of his blade. While not all mythologists agree, it's possible that Excalibur, the legendary sword of King Arthur, which in Welsh is Caladcholg, was inspired by stories of MacRoth's sword. To quote from Irish writer and translator T.W. Rolleston's 1911 book Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race, the sword of Fergus was a fairy weapon called the Caladcholg, hard dinter, a name of which Arthur's more famous Excalibur is a Latinized corruption. 2. Claíomh Solais, the sword of light. Claíomh Solais was the sword of Nuada Ergitlam, or Nuada of the Silver Hand, the first ruler of the Tuatha De Danann who lost his hand, or arm, it's still up for debate, in the first battle of Moytura. One of the 4 treasures, or jewels, of the Tuatha De Danann, Claíomh Solais was sometimes described as Nuada's Cannel, a glowing, bright torch. Once unsheathed, no enemy could survive its wrath. To quote from Celtic scholar Whitley Stokes' 1891 translation of the Second Battle of Moytura, out of Findius was brought the sword of Nuada. When it was drawn from its deadly sheath, no one ever escaped from it, and it was irresistible. Claíomh Solais is the first in a long folkloric tradition of glowing swords, which includes Cruaidín, which you'll learn about next. 3. Cruaidín, the hard-headed stealing. While it's also known as Socht Sword, Cruaidín most famously belonged to the Ulster hero Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cullen, sometimes called the Hound of Ulster. According to Ectra Cormac y Tir Tanigri, Cormac's Adventures in the Land of Promise, the sword had a hilt of gold and a belt of silver, and shone at night like a candle. Imbued with magical properties, Cruaidín could cut a hair off a man's head without touching his flesh, and more impressively and disturbingly, could cut a man in half without either half knowing, quote, what had befallen the other. In his 1987 A Dictionary of Irish Mythology, historian Peter Beresford Ellis notes that Cruaidín is occasionally confused with Caladcholg because its name has the same root, Cruaid, meaning hard. Cruaidín is the diminutive form. What's more, given its glowing nature, some scholars, T.F. O'Reilly included, interpret Cruaidín as a direct folkloric descendant, if you will, of the aforementioned Claíomh Solais. To quote O'Reilly, Cuchulainn possessed Cruaidín, which shone at night like a torch. In folk tales, the lightning sword has survived as the sword of light, and Claíomh Solais, possessed by a giant and won from him by a hero. And that comes from the book Early Irish History and Mythology, published in 1946. 4. Fragarach, the Answerer. Fragarach, also Fragarach or Frecraid, originally belonged to Manannán mac Lir, Irish sea god and stepfather to the Irish sun god Lug. Upon Lug's departure from Tir na Beo, the land of the living, Manannán gifts him the sword along with other magical items, including a horse, Ein Var or Ein Bar, that can gallop over land and sea alike, and a boat, a currach named Squabatoin or Wave Sweeper, that can read a navigator's thoughts and adjust its course accordingly. Yes, that means the autonomous vehicle is the brainchild of Irish mythology. But I digress. Fragarach was a, quote, terrible sword that could, quote, cut through any mail, according to Rolleston's Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race. Ellis adds that, quote, every wound Fragarach made was mortal. And that's from his Dictionary of Irish Mythology. In later legend, Fragarach becomes one of the magical items found within the treasure bag of the Fianna, also known as the crane bag. The items inside can only be removed at high tide, otherwise the bag remains empty. In later legend, the sword features prominently in author R.J. Howell's modern Celtic fantasy short story Fragarach, which is part of my Neon Druid collection. Disclaimer, if you go on Wikipedia, there is a dubiously sourced entry about Fragarach actually belonging to Nuada of the Silver Hand, who then gives the sword to Lug after losing his hand in battle. And while I can't find any source material to support this claim, it is interesting to note that in Irish poet and Celtic mythologist Ella Young's 1909 work, The Coming of Lug, A Celtic Wonder Tale Retold, Manannán gives Lug not Fragarach, but the Sword of Light. Young even refers to the sword as the fourth jewel, making clear that this is indeed a reference to the, or at least a, Claíomh Solais, a weapon that traditionally belonged to Nuada. As we learned from O'Reilly in the previous section, the Sword of Light, or lightning sword, is a recurring motif in Irish folklore. Hence, it's easy to see how storytellers might mix up the names of these swords, either intentionally or unintentionally, in their interpretations and retellings. 5a, Fraoch Mór, Great Fury. 5b, Fraoch, Beag, Little Fury. In addition to Fragarach, the ocean god and otherworld overseer Manannán mac Lir carried two swords that were both called Fraoch, Fury. Fraoch Mór, Great Fury, and Fraoch Beag, Little Fury, although it's likely that Little Fury was actually a dirk or short dagger. These weapons reappear in later myths, passed down from Manannán mac Lir to the love god Angus Og, and from Angus Og to his foster son Diarmid Ua Dovna. Diarmid, nicknamed Diarmid of the Love Spot, was a warrior of the Fianna, best known for his role in the Finian cycle tale The Pursuit of Diarmid and Grania. Long story short, the dude runs off with the Princess Grania, who was betrothed to Finn McCool at the time. The Fianna give chase, and ultimately Diarmid gets gored to death by a magical boar who's also his stepbrother, and then Diarmid's stepfather, the love god Angus Og, temporarily reanimates his stepson's corpse so they can say their goodbyes. Don't you just love Irish myths? Note, in these later myths, the swords have slightly different names. Moroltach instead of Fraoch Mór, and Beagltach instead of Fraoch Beag, but their meanings remain the same. Great Fury and Little Fury. Unfortunately for Diarmid, the blades of these swords don't seem to be as strong or as sharp as they were when they first appeared in the mythological cycle. To quote from Irish historian and journalist Standish O'Grady's 1880 translation of The Pursuit of Diarmid and Grania, and thereupon he drew the Beagltach from the sheath in which it was kept, and struck a heavy stroke thereof upon the wild boar's back stoutly and full bravely, yet he cut not a single bristle upon him, but made two pieces of his sword. 6. Gorm Glas, Blue-Green. Gorm Glas, the Blue-Green, was the sword of the Ulster king Conor MacNessa. As detailed in Irish folklorist Lady Gregory's 1902 work Cuchulainn of Muirthemna, the story of the men of the Red Branch of Ulster, Conor loaned the, quote, great sword to his son Fiachra, aka Fiachra the Fair, along with his enchanted shield O'Hain, more on that later, so that he might go, quote, do bravery and great deeds. The results were mixed. While Fiachra, Gorm Glas in hand, bravely led the attack on the Red Branch hostel, he was bested in combat by Eolin, son of Fergus MacRath, owner of the sword Caladcholg, and was ultimately killed by the Red Branch warrior Caladcholg, who famously made the brain ball. We'll get to it, don't worry. That would kill Fiachra's father, Conor. 7. Mac An Lúin, son of the spear. Mac An Lúin was the sword of famed Finian cycle hero Finn McCool. It was said that the sword never had to cut twice, for it killed with every stroke, and Finn only used it in times of greatest danger. While the sword's name perhaps suggests a relation to the enchanted spear Lúin Celtair, which you'll learn about soon, Scottish poet James Macpherson presents an alternate origin and name for the sword: son of Luno. Luno was a smith of Lochlan, whom Finn, Fingal in Macpherson's poems of Oisin, chased across the waves for 10 days before catching him at the Isle of Skye and forcing him to make the sword. For this reason, Mac An Lúin is also sometimes called Son of Waves. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention that while Macpherson purported that his poems, first published in 1761, Fingal, in 1763, Tamora, were translations of Dark Age-era Gaelic manuscripts, that turned out to be not so true. 8. Orna, Little Pale Green. The sword of the Fomorian king Tethra, Orna could speak and recount its deeds when unsheathed. After Tethra's defeat at the Second Battle of Moytora, Orna was picked up by Ogma, the Irish god of eloquence and champion of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the sword proceeded to recount everything it had done while in the hands of its previous owner. Tethra, for his part, went on to rule the otherworld realm Mag Mell, Plain of Happiness. However, according to the same source material, re Whitley Stokes' 1891 translation of the Battle of Moytora, swords talking on the battlefield was a fairly common occurrence in mythological Ireland. Ireland. There's even an explanation for why weapons like Orna were compelled to speak. And I quote, "Then the sword Orna related whatsoever had been done by it, for it was the custom of swords at that time, when unsheathed, to set forth the deeds that had been done by them. And therefore swords are entitled to the tribute of cleansing them after they have been unsheathed. Hence also charms are preserved in swords thenceforward." Now the reason why demons used to speak from weapons at that time was because weapons were worshipped by human beings at that epoch, and the weapons were among the safeguards of that time. End quote. 9. Díoltach, Retaliator. Along with Fragarach and Fraoch Mór, Díoltach, Retaliator, was one of the three main swords of the sea god Manannán mac Lir. The sword, quote, never failed to slay, according to author Charles Squire's 1919 book, Celtic Myth and Legend. Manannán mac Lir gave Díoltach to Naoise, a champion of the Red Branch, and in one version of events, a rival champion, Ewan mac Durhach, takes the sword from Naoise and kills him with it at the behest of Conor mac Nessa. In another version of events, Naoise and his two brothers are captured and are to be executed. But since none of the brothers want to see the others slain, Naoise offers Díoltach, Retaliator, to their executioner, a Norse prince named Maena. Maena uses the sword to slay all three brothers with a single stroke. Spears from Irish mythology. 10. Burya, Spit Spear. Also known as the Spear of Fiacha, or Fiachel, Burya was an enchanted, venomous spear. The warrior Fiacha, a follower of Cúl, leader of the Fianna, gave the spear to Cúl's son, Finn MacCool, so that he might defeat Elaine, an evil creature / former member of the Tuatha Dé Danann who resided 364 days a year in the Otherworld. Each and every Samhain, the monster, nicknamed the Burner, would wreak havoc on the royal residence of Tara with his fire breath after lulling its defenders to sleep with enchanted music. Specifically, Elaine plays, or weaponizes, I should say, the Seantre, lullaby strain of ancient Irish music, which is frequently deployed by gods, druids, and other musicians in the myths in order to incapacitate opponents. That's where Burya comes into play. In Lady Gregory's version of events, Fiacha teaches Finn how to unlock the power of the spear, instructing his pupil as follows: "When you will hear the music of the Sidhe, let you strip the covering off the head of the spear and put it to your forehead, and the power of the spear will not let sleep come upon you." And that's from the 1902 book, Gods and Fighting Men. In another version of the story, Fiacha gives the spear to Finn precisely because he does not know how to use it himself. Either way, the story ends with Finn holding Burya to his forehead and, in some accounts, inhaling its fumes, making him immune to Elaine's music and allowing him to kill the creature with the spear. 11. Cletane, Little Spear. Cletane was one of Cuchulainn's many spears, which he used to slay many warriors. Maeve, Queen of Connacht, coveted the little spear and sent a bard, Reg, to request the spear from Cuchulainn on the grounds that one must never refuse a gift requested by a poet. The request angered Cuchulainn so much that instead of handing Cletane over to the bard, he flung it at him. Whoopsie. Here's what happened next, according to Joseph Dunn's 1914 translation of the cattle raid of Cooley. Thereupon Cuchulainn hurled the spearlet at him so that it struck him in the nape of the neck and fell out through his mouth on the ground. And the only words Reg uttered were these: "This precious gift is readily ours." And his soul separated from his body at the ford. Here we find a nice, well, not so nice, example of how Irish myths are often tied up with place names and geography, as discussed in my video on the differences between myths, legends, folktales, and fairy tales. Because as the story goes, after Cuchulainn spears the bard by the ford, he tosses the busted copper, or umul, from his spear, which was presumably damaged as a result of the impact with the bard's spinal column, into the adjacent stream. Henceforth, the stream is known as Uman Sra, or Copper Stream. The ford, meanwhile, earns the moniker At Solemn Shet, Ford of the Ready Treasure. 12. Del-Chlis, Charioteer's Goad. According to Ellis, Del-Chlis originally referred to a split piece of wood and later became the term used for a charioteer's goad or spur. The capitalized Del-Chlis refers to a spear used by Cuchulainn, who, in the myths, often fought from his chariot. In his very first battle, Cuchulainn famously uses Del-Chlis to slay the three supernatural sons of Nechan Skeini, who had boasted of killing more men of Ulster than any other living beings. Cuchulainn rides away from their fortress, with their three severed heads hanging from his chariot. 13. Gae-Ruadh, Spear of Asal. Also known as the lightning spear or simply Lug's spear, the Gae-Sail was one of the 4 treasures or jewels of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The sword Claíomh Solais was another. To quote from Whitley Stokes' 1891 translation of the Second Battle of Moytora, out of Gorius was brought the spear that Lug had. No battle was ever won against it or him who held it in his hand. The sun god Lug, also known as Lug Lamphada, of the long arm or of the long throw, famously uses the spear in the Second Battle of Moytora to help the Tuatha Dé Danann vanquish the Fomorians. An enchanted weapon, the Gae-Sail never misses its mark and always returns to its thrower, similar to how Mjölnir returns to Thor in Norse mythology. 14. Gae-Bolga, belly spear. The most famous of Cuchulainn's spears, Gae-Bolg originally belonged to the female warrior Scáthach, champion of Alba, aka Scotland, who ran a military academy on the aptly named Scáth's Island, thought to be the Isle of Skye. During Cuchulainn's training on the island, Scáthach gifts the Red Branch warrior the spear, but first she teaches him how to throw it. With one foot. Rather than being thrown by hand, the Gae-Bolg is cast, quote, from between the fork of the foot, according to Dunn's 1914 translation of the Cattle Raid of Cooley. But that isn't even the strangest thing about this weapon. Also known as the barbed spear, the Gae-Bolg makes a single wound when entering the body of an enemy, but once inside, 30 barbs pop open, inflicting gruesome damage. So gruesome, in fact, that the spear, quote, could not be drawn out of a man's flesh till the flesh had been cut about it. Yeesh. Being a mythological warrior was messy business, which is probably why Cuchulainn usually had his trusty sidekick in charioteer Leg take care of the post-killing Gae-Bolg removal in the myths. Throughout the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology, Cuchulainn uses the spear to kill, amongst others, Loch Mac Mophibus, a champion of Maeve, Ferdia, who trained with Cuchulainn under Scáthach, and even his own son, Conley. The spear develops such a reputation that Cuchulainn's opponents often flee or attempt to flee the battlefield when they hear the hero call for it. 15. Gae-Ruadh, red javelin. Gae-Ruadh was a spear that originally belonged to Manannán mac Lir. It was notable for having 2 prongs or points. As was the case with Fraoch Mór, one of Manannán mac Lir's swords, Gae-Ruadh, the red javelin or red spear, shows up in later legends in the hands of Diarmid Ua Dúbhna, who inherits it from the love god Angus Og. Once again, there is a slight name change from Gae-Ruadh to Gae-Deirg, but the meaning remains the same. Red spear. Note, in the pursuit of Diarmid and Grania, Diarmid is also seen wielding a yellow spear, Gae-Buí, which he uses to not such great effect in his fight against the aforementioned magical boar/stepbrother. And I quote, "Then Diarmid put his small white-colored, ruddy-nailed finger into the silken string of the Gae-Buí and made a careful cast at the pig so that he smote him in the fair middle of his face and of his forehead. Nevertheless he cut not a single bristle upon him, nor did he give him wound or scratch. Diarmid's courage was lessened at that." End quote. 16. Lúin Celhair, Spear of Celhair. Often given simply as Lúin, this enchanted venomous spear or lance is discovered on the battlefield after the Second Battle of Moytora, having belonged to, quote, some chief of the mythic Tuatha Dé Danann race, to quote William H. Hennessy's introduction to his 1889 translation of Mesca Ulad, or The Intoxication of the Ultonians. Granted, Lady Gregory asserts in Gods and Fighting Men that the spear actually belonged to the king of Persia. Previous ownership aside, what all storytellers can agree on is that Celtar mac Utahar, a Red Branch warrior described as, quote, a grey, tall, very terrible hero of Ulster, end quote, in the story of Macduff's pig, eventually claims the spear. A possible reimagining or reboot of the mythological cycles Gae-Sail, aka Lug's spear, aka the lightning spear, the Ulster cycle's Lúin is notoriously difficult to tame. According to the Irish narrative, The Destruction of Dodurga's Hostel, upon tasting the blood of an enemy, Lúin writhes in the hands of its owner. If no blood is tasted, the spear must be quenched in a cauldron of venom, lest it turn on its owner and burst into flame. Celtar ultimately dies from Lúin's own venom after a drop of blood from a slain enemy inadvertently drips from the spear onto Celhair's flesh. Shields from Irish mythology. 17. Derg-Druimnech, red-backed. Derg-Druimnech was the shield of Domhnall Bríc, king of the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada, which encompassed parts of northeastern Ireland and the western seaboard of Scotland. During the Battle of Moira, which was said to have occurred in 637 CE, the Ulster hero Conall Cernach cast a spear at Domhnall. Here, I'll let Irish historian P.W. Joyce tell you what happened next. To quote his 1903 book, A Social History of Ancient Ireland, the javelin of Conall, which was aimed at King Domhnall, passed through 3 shields interposed by his followers to shelter him and struck Derg-Druimnech, i.e. red-backed, the golden shield of the monarch. monarch himself. Did you catch that? No pun intended. 3 warriors placed their shields in front of their king to protect him, but Conall's spear went through all 3 shields, and presumably through all 3 warriors, before becoming embedded in Derg-Druimnech. And while Dummel is wounded in the attack, the shield does an adequate but not perfect job of protecting him from the spear. The king and his fellow Delriada warriors ultimately win the battle. 18. Ochain, Moaner. Also given as Ahin, meaning ocean, and sometimes referred to as the ear of beauty, this enchanted shield belonged to Ulster king Conor MacNessa. In Whitley Stokes' translation of the Tidings of Conor MacNessa, published in the journal Éireadh in 1910, it is said of Ochain that, quote, 4 rims of gold were round it. The shield famously moaned a warning whenever its bearer was in danger. The 3 chief waves of Ireland, Tua, Claíomh, and Rory, would roar in response to its wails. Along with his sword Gorm Glas, Conor lent the shield to his son Fiachra, who led the attack on the Red Branch hostel. After Fiachra was bested in combat by Eowlin, Ochain moaned a warning, bringing Conall Carnech to Fiachra's temporary rescue. Staffs and slingshots from Irish mythology. 19. Crann-Tabuáll, staff sling, and Caer-Clis, feetball. A favorite weapon of Irish heroes, the staff sling consisted of a long staff with a short sling at one end for hurling projectiles. While the staff slings themselves did not usually have any special significance, the projectiles or slingshots often did. A slingshot ball made for a specific purpose was called Caer-Clis, feetball, or Ubalclis, feet apple. Lug used such a ball, called the Taflim, to kill his own grandfather, the Fomorian leader and big bad of the mythological cycle, Baelor of the Evil Eye. According to Ellis, the Taflim was made by mixing the blood of toads, bears, and vipers with sea sand and letting it harden. Another type of Caer-Clis was a Leithroid Inshin, or brain ball, which was made from the brains of an enemy and hardened with lime. The most famous brain ball was made by Conall Carnech from the brain of the Leinster king Misgegra. This brain ball was stolen by the Connacht warrior Cet Mac Magog and used to kill Conor MacNessa. 20. Lorgmore, the Great Staff. Also known as Lorg an Fade, the Staff of Wrath, Lorgmore was the weapon of choice of the Dagda, father of the Irish gods. It has been described as a gigantic magical club, so large that the Dagda dragged it around on wheels. The head of the staff or club had the power to slay 9 enemies in a single blow, while the handle could revive those slain with a single touch. Or as it's described in the medieval Irish manuscript, the Yellow Book of Lecain, the Logmore has a, quote, smooth end and a, quote, rough end, one that, quote, slays and one that, quote, brings the dead back to life. Based on these life-giving and taking properties, anthropology and linguistics professor Garrett S. Olmsted found parallels between the Logmore and weapons from other mythologies. And I quote, in India, Indra, the controller of the middle region, has an ankusha, hook, goad, which accomplishes the same thing as the Dagda's staff. In Scandinavia, Thor, the son of the controller of the upper realm, controls the hammer Mjölnir with the same properties as the ankusha. And that comes from the book The Gods of the Celts and the Indo-Europeans, published in 1994. Olmsted also reveals that in the Yellow Book of Lecain, a description of the Logmore is given that might change the mental image we hold of this weapon in our minds. To quote Olmsted's translation, the Dagda had behind him a forked branch with a wheel, Gabal Gika Rohak, which required 8 men to pull it so that the track after him was enough for the boundary ditch of a province. According to Olmsted, the forked club, or Gabal Lorg, described here is, quote, undoubtedly the same device as the Lorgmore, which means, yes, much like Poseidon and his trident from Greek mythology, the weapon of choice of one of Irish mythology's greatest gods is, at its core, a big fork. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment and basically just tap all of the shiny buttons, and by the end of it, make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really, really helps. And if you want to learn more about the darker side of Irish mythology, check out my book, Irish Monsters in Your Pocket, a tiny little book about Irish dragons, werewolves, vampires, banshees, headless horsemen, and other beastly beings. My name is I.E. Neverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out.